has always had a way of hiding what it cannot control and forgetting what it cannot conquer. History as it's been written is not always the truth. It's often a reflection of who held the pen. For centuries, Africa has been portrayed through a lens of struggle and suffering, of poverty and conflict. But beneath that veil lies a deeper, more powerful truth. There are ancient tribes, mighty civilizations, and spiritual legacies that have been deliberately erased or left untold. Today, I want to take you on a journey, not just across geography, but through time, into the heart of Africa, where 7 hidden tribes once stood with knowledge, culture, and strength the world chose not to teach you about. And maybe, just maybe, when this is over, you'll look at Africa not as the forgotten continent, but as the foundation of humanity. Long before colonial borders were drawn with rulers and greed, the African continent was a tapestry of kingdoms and tribes, each one unique in its contribution to civilization. And yet you never heard their names in your school books. You never saw their wisdom displayed in documentaries. You never felt their power, because power like that scares the system. There was the tribe of the Siddis, descendants of African warriors who journeyed through India and rose to ranks of royalty and leadership. Their bloodline carried strength beyond borders, and their influence touched continents, yet they remain invisible in mainstream narratives. Ask yourself why. Why is it that the African story is always one of slavery, not sovereignty, one of suffering, not sophistication? Then there were the Tellem people, a mystical tribe that lived high in the cliffs of Mali, building homes in the sky long before modern engineering could understand how their architecture defied gravity, and their spiritual practices connected them to something greater, deep. Their knowledge of nature, of life and afterlife, of the stars and the soul was sacred. But they were wiped from historical memory, replaced by newer settlers. You were never taught about them because their brilliance didn't fit the narrative of a backward Africa. But backward is not what they were. They were advanced, connected, and intentional. In the heart of southern Africa, the kingdom of Mapungubwe thrived, a hidden tribe that built stone palaces, traded with faraway nations, and held gold not just as wealth, but as a symbol of spiritual power. These were not primitive people. They were intellectuals, spiritualists, and artists. Their empire stood tall while parts of Europe were still finding their footing. Yet their story was buried quite literally. When colonial excavators discovered the golden rhino of Mapungubwe, they hid it away in museums, away from the world's eyes, because truth disrupts the foundation of deception. Another forgotten people are the Lemba, a tribe so mysterious and spiritual that their oral traditions were dismissed as myth until science confirmed their lineage, traced back to the ancient Middle East, connecting them to the priestly tribes of old. But instead of reverence, they were ignored. Instead of being studied, they were silenced. Why? Because the idea that Africa holds sacred bloodlines shatters the illusion of exclusivity. It questions who the chosen really are. The Lemba kept their customs, kept their codes, and held to a spiritual path even when the world tried to erase them. Far to the west, the Sahara people of Senegal carried a spiritual and philosophical knowledge that rivals any school of thought you've ever heard of. Their understanding of the universe, the soul, and ancestral connection runs so deep, even their oral stories carry cosmic weight. They spoke of stars, cycles of life and energy in a time when other parts of the world were barely writing alphabets. Their spiritual leaders weren't just religious figures, they were scientists of the unseen. But you never heard about them because that would mean admitting that deep, profound wisdom came from people the world tried to classify as unseen. In the Great Lakes region, the Batutsi, often confused with modern social identities, were once part of a sacred culture rooted in divine rule, cattle economy, and harmony with the earth. Before the colonial powers weaponized identity to divide and conquer, these people stood as guardians of sacred traditions. They held secrets of governance, spirituality, and ancestral honoring that were pure and untainted. But division stripped them of their unity, and their ancient wisdom was overshadowed by political chaos. What was once sacred became politicized, and the world never told you the full story. And high in the mountains of Ethiopia, among the rugged landscapes and the echoes of time, lived the Bata Israel, not just a community, but a testimony to ancient faith, preservation, and identity. They carried spiritual codes and rituals that predated modern institutions. They observed sacred traditions in secret, hiding from empires and missionaries who saw their beliefs as a threat. They were African, and they were spiritual. And that combination was too dangerous to allow into mainstream thought. So instead of honoring them, history erased them, or worse, distorted them. But the truth doesn't die, it just waits for the right time to rise again. Now you may be asking, why does this matter? What does it change? It matters because the world has fed you a single story of Africa, and a single story is a lie. When you erase tribes, you erase identity. When you hide truth, you control thought. If you don't know where you come from, it's easier to accept where others put you. These 7 tribes are not just names, they are windows into a deeper Africa, an Africa that gave birth to kings, queens, philosophers, priests, architects, scientists, and an Africa that existed in harmony before conquest, that held knowledge before colonization, and that still whispers to those willing to listen. You have to ask yourself, what else have they hidden from us? What other truths lie buried beneath the sand, beneath the silence, beneath the shame? You weren't taught this in school because real power is dangerous to the oppressor. If young black minds grew up knowing they came from genius, royalty, and sacred wisdom, then who could stop them? Who could break them? That's why it's hidden. That's why it's ignored. But not anymore. Because we're in a time where truth is rising, where voices once silenced are speaking louder than ever, where history books are being rewritten, not with revenge, but with righteousness. The 7 hidden tribes of Africa are not just a lesson in anthropology, they are a call to rediscover what was stolen, to reawaken what was buried, and to reclaim what still belongs to us. You're not just watching this speech, you're part of a movement to break free from mental chains, from historical erasure, from cultural exile. You've been told who you are by systems that never knew your soul. Now it's time to find the truth for yourself. These tribes are not just history, they are you. Their wisdom is in your blood. Their stories are in your DNA. Their strength is your inheritance. The world may not have taught you about them, but now you know, and once you know, you cannot go back. You carry the knowledge now, and with that knowledge comes responsibility to learn, to teach, to share, and to live with purpose. The truth will not remain hidden forever. The tribes may have been forgotten, but they were never gone. They were waiting for you, and now the question is not why weren't you taught this? The real question is, what will you do now that you know? Much of what we've been taught about Africa is incomplete, and what's missing is an accidental. The continent's rich legacy, its advanced societies, and its spiritual depth have not been lost. They have been deliberately concealed. These truths didn't vanish because they lacked value or significance. On the contrary, they were hidden because they possessed a power that challenged the dominant narratives of conquest and colonization. The silence around these stories is not due to their absence in the records of time, but due to a strategic decision to bury them under layers of revision and erasure. When a people are stripped of their origin stories, when their ancestors are turned into shadows, it becomes easier to control the generations that follow. It becomes easier to reduce kings and queens into mere footnotes and sacred civilizations into tribal myths. But truth has a way of resurfacing. It calls out through ruins, whispers in oral traditions, and breathes in the DNA of descendants who feel, even without being told, that they come from greatness. Across the globe, people have been taught to look at Africa through a narrow lens, one that emphasizes pain over pride, poverty over power, survival over sovereignty. But there is a shift happening. As more people begin to question what they've learned and who they've learned it from, a deeper curiosity grows, and that curiosity leads to rediscovery. The process of unearthing these hidden stories isn't just about rewriting textbooks, it's about reclaiming dignity. It's about restoring the brilliance that was deliberately pushed into darkness. When you start to uncover the stories of advanced societies like Mapungubwe or the cosmic wisdom of the Serer, you begin to realize that Africa wasn't waiting to be civilized. It was already thriving. Its people weren't wandering in ignorance. They were guiding their lives by ancient principles that modern systems are only beginning to understand. This deliberate hiding of history, wasn't just to protect colonial pride, it was to prevent future generations from knowing their true potential. When you erase a lineage of genius, courage, and spiritual power, you create a vacuum of identity. And into that vacuum you insert labels, lies, and limitations. But the truth is resilient. The legacies of those who came before us are too strong to be permanently buried. They rise through our talents, our resistance, our innovation, and our hunger to know more. The reason many people feel a deep disconnect from their roots is not because those roots are broken, but because they were covered. And once you begin peeling back the layers, you find out that history didn't forget Africa, it feared its influence. The stories of these hidden tribes, like the Siddis, who navigated continents, the Tellem, who built in the sky, or the Lemba, who preserved ancient codes, aren't just fascinating facts, they are proof that the African mind has always been brilliant, that African spirituality has always been profound, that African culture has always been worthy of global recognition. And when these truths are reclaimed, it doesn't just heal wounds, it empowers future. Because when someone sees themselves reflected in greatness, when they realize they come from builders, thinkers, and visionaries, they walk taller, they speak louder, they dream bolder. This isn't about rewriting history for the sake of ego. It's about restoring the balance of truth. The world has celebrated one version of the past for too long, and that version has silenced the voices of entire civilizations. But now, with every uncovered truth, with every shared story, the light is returning. And in that light, we begin to see clearly. We see that Africa's narrative was never one of lack. It was one of abundance, hidden to keep others in power. But no more. The era of awakening is here. The stories are surfacing, the legacy is unfolding, and those who once walked in forgotten footsteps are now walking toward a future shaped by truth. When we talk about understanding where we come from, we're not just chasing facts, we're chasing meaning. Because facts can tell you what happened, but only identity can tell you why it matters. There's something sacred about knowing the stories your ancestors lived, the lands they walked, the values they passed down through generations. It's more than just historical curiosity. It's about anchoring yourself in something real, something that transcends borders, textbooks, and time. When a person doesn't know their true past, they begin to believe what the world tells them. They start accepting limitations that were never theirs. But when someone begins to uncover their hidden roots, something powerful happens. They start to move differently, think differently, speak differently, because they finally know that their existence is not random, it is intentional. So much of the world has been taught to associate African identity with tragedy. But before the chains, there were crowns. Before the displacement, there was divine connection. Before the exploitation, there was excellence. And the deeper you dig, the more you uncover brilliance that has been buried beneath stereotypes and shadows. Learning about those forgotten tribes isn't just an educational experience, it's a spiritual one. It redefines how you see yourself, how you see your community, and how you walk through the world. Because when you realize that your lineage includes sacred wisdom, bold resilience, and unmatched creativity, you no longer ask for permission to be great. You understand it's your birthright. And identity is not just a name or a flag. It's the inner fire that tells you who you are, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise. It's the silent strength that guides your choices, that reminds you of your worth, and that fuels your persistence. When you don't know who you are, you chase everything around you. But when you do, you walk with purpose. You don't just try to survive, you aim to thrive. You don't shrink in rooms, you stand tall. You don't beg for acceptance, you walk in confidence. Because you understand you're not just a product of chance. You are the living continuation of something sacred. Too often people are disconnected from their heritage and wonder why they feel incomplete. It's because the stories that built them were taken from them. And when you take away the story, you take away the direction. But when even fragments of those stories return, when the names of the forgotten are spoken again, when the truths long buried begin to rise, something inside you shifts. You begin to see that you were never small, you were just made to feel that way. You were never lost, you were simply led away from the truth. But once you find even a glimpse of who you truly are, the path becomes clearer. The journey becomes deeper. The destination becomes greater. Knowing where you come from gives you the courage to fight for where you're going. It gives you strength in the face of struggle. It reminds you that you were built for more than just survival. The blood in your veins carries the memories of those who built kingdoms, led revolutions, healed nations, and spoke to the spirit of the universe before the modern world ever gave it a name. That is not just history, that is you. You are the product of resilience. You are the result of brilliance. You are the echo of voices that refuse to be silenced. And once you recognize the value of your identity, you start to understand your responsibilities. You become a guardian of truth. You become a bridge for those still searching. You become a voice for those who never got to tell their story. This isn't about pride, it's about restoration. It's about repairing the broken links in the chain of memory and realizing that who you are is exactly who you were always meant to be. You don't need validation from systems that never knew your spirit. You need connection to a legacy that already accepted you before the world even knew your name. And in that moment of connection, when the past meets the present, something powerful is born. A new kind of confidence, a new sense of direction, a new fire that cannot be put out. Because it's no longer just about learning what happened, it's about remembering who you are. Africa was never behind. That idea was planted, it was repeated so many times through books, classrooms, and media that generations began to believe it. But belief doesn't equal truth. And the truth is that Africa was never waiting to be developed. It was already evolving on its own terms. What the world calls progress was happening across the continent in unique, profound ways long before it was interrupted. Africa wasn't standing still. It was leading in ways that couldn't be measured by foreign standards. It had built empires with spiritual depth, cultures with balance, and societies that thrived in harmony with nature and with one another. It didn't lack intelligence, it had a different kind of genius, one rooted in spirit, in rhythm, in wisdom, passed not through paper but through blood, breath, and memory. The world didn't arrive in Africa with civilization. It came with disruption. The systems that existed were not broken. They were broken apart. The kingdoms that were thriving weren't rescued. They were raided. And what was presented as development was actually dismantling. What was offered as education often replaced indigenous knowledge. What was labeled as religion often sought to erase sacred ways that had existed for thousands of years. What they called advancement often meant erasing languages, beliefs, traditions, and communities that had developed their own sophisticated ways of living and understanding the universe. This isn't bitterness, this is clarity. The truth must be told, not to live in the past, but to heal the damage of forgetting it. In Africa, time was not just a measurement. It was a cycle. Land was not just territory. It was sacred. The elders were not just old. They were living libraries. Spirituality wasn't separate from life. It was life. Every part of existence had meaning. And when people say Africa was behind, they are looking through the lens of one worldview. They are measuring greatness by things like factories, wars, and buildings. But Africa had greatness in its silence, in its harmony, in its understanding of what it meant to live with purpose. The people had systems of governance, of healing, of education, and of justice. They had art, music, architecture, and language that held the weight of generations. These things were not primitive. They were powerful. There were complex trade routes running across deserts and rivers, connecting people from coast to coast. There were astronomers who mapped the stars with precision. There were builders who crafted cities out of stone without mortar. There were storytellers who passed down the essence of the universe through generations without ever writing it down. These were not scattered people, they were connected. These were not lost tribes, they were targeted tribes. Because where there is knowledge, there is power. And where there is power, there is fear. And systems of domination have always feared what they cannot control. The world has a way of telling stories that make the winner look like the hero. But Africa's story is deeper than the version written by invaders. Before the continent was carved up into artificial borders, before its people were chained and shipped across oceans, before its resources were stripped and renamed, There was balance, there was strength, there was light. And even now that light hasn't gone out. It's still glowing in the languages, the traditions, the names, the skin, the music, and the spirit of African people across the world. The connection never died. It was buried. And the time to uncover it is now. Africa's progress was interrupted, not non-existent. Its development was distorted, not absent. Its glory was hidden, not missing. The truth is that what many societies consider modern, Africa already had in ways that were deeply advanced. The difference is that Africa's form of advancement was not centered on control, profit, or conquest. It was centered on life, on balance, on spirituality. And because that way of being couldn't be exploited or monetized in the same way, it was labeled as backward, when in reality it was simply different, and in many ways more advanced. Africa doesn't need validation from the systems that once tried to erase it. Its value isn't proven by recognition. Its genius doesn't depend on outside approval. It exists with or without the spotlight. But the world is slowly waking up to what was always there. People are beginning to ask deeper questions, and in doing so, they are discovering deeper truths. That Africa was never waiting to be saved. It was, and still is, a source of untapped wisdom, strength, and brilliance. And that recognition isn't just about restoring the past. It's about building a future that finally reflects the whole truth. When a tribe is erased from the records of history, it is not only the people who disappear, it is an entire worldview, a unique system of thought, and a sacred relationship between humanity and creation that vanishes with them. The loss is not just physical, it's spiritual. When cultures are pushed into silence, the world loses languages that carried ancient meanings, practices that honored the earth, and wisdom that held generations together. These were not nameless groups wandering in the shadows of civilization. They were intentional societies rooted in tradition, knowledge, and purpose. Their disappearance is not due to a lack of significance, but to the deliberate hand of erasure. A strategy that has been used time and time again to weaken the collective memory of a people and disconnect them from their origin. Removing the names and stories of these tribes from history books is not accidental. It is a method of control. When you take away the stories that form identity, you make people question their worth. You create a void in which anything can be planted: shame, confusion, inferiority. Erasing a tribe is more than removing them from the land. It's erasing their impact, their ideas, their spirituality. And in doing so, the erasers attempt to rewrite who owns wisdom, who defines power, and who deserves to be remembered. When you control the narrative, you control the future. That's why so many of these tribes, with all their brilliance, were kept in silence. Not because they were unimportant, but because their truth threatened the myths that the world was trying to preserve. These communities had profound insight into how the world works, both seen and unseen. They knew how to live in harmony with nature, how to govern with moral integrity, how to teach without institutions, and how to heal without modern medicine. Their knowledge wasn't recorded in textbooks or stored in laboratories, but it was passed down with care through rituals, songs, symbols, and memory. And that memory still lives in the descendants who carry their names, their rhythms, their insights. The fact that these people are still standing, still searching, still rising is itself a quiet revolution. It means the attempt to erase them didn't fully succeed. Something survived, something strong. To speak the names of these hidden tribes is to reclaim what was stolen. It is to light a candle in a place the world tried to keep dark. And when you light that candle, it doesn't just illuminate the past, it changes the way the future unfolds. It empowers those who never saw themselves in history to finally understand that they were always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be seen again. Telling these stories isn't just a cultural exercise, it's a spiritual act. It's an act of dignity, of resistance, of truth. Because when you speak the truth about those who came before, you begin to repair what was broken. You begin to rethread the fabric that was torn. And in that repair, there is healing, not just for one people, but for all. Because this isn't just an African story, this is a human story. Every time a tribe is forgotten, humanity loses a piece of its soul. Every time knowledge is suppressed, the world becomes more disconnected. These lost names and languages were not regional, they were universal. Their principles could have changed how the world approached leadership, how communities lived together, how spirituality was practiced. Instead, that wisdom was hidden away, locked in silence, and replaced with systems that thrived on division, competition, and exploitation. But now the silence is breaking. When you restore the presence of those who were erased, you're not simply adding names to a list, you're reshaping the global understanding of what it means to be wise, to be powerful, to be sacred. You're reminding the world that value doesn't only exist in what's visible, that truth doesn't disappear because it's buried, and that honoring those voices isn't just about the past, it's about setting the foundation for a more honest future. Every time you learn about a forgotten tribe, every time you share their story, every time you challenge the version of history you were handed, you are doing the work of restoration. You are reviving voices that still have something to say. You are allowing their presence to re-enter the conversation, not as victims of time, but as carriers of truth. And the more we tell these stories, the harder it becomes to erase them again. Because truth, once awakened, does not sleep. It continues, it grows, and it calls others into remembrance. To restore what was erased is not to dwell in sorrow. It is to awaken the sleeping parts of our identity and recognize the brilliance that was always ours. The names may have faded from the records, but they never disappeared from the earth. They are still here, in spirit, in ancestry, in resilience, and the act of speaking them now brings them forward, not as remnants of a forgotten world, but as seeds of a new one. You are not here by accident. Every breath you take, every step you walk, carries the invisible strength of generations who walked this earth before you, with purpose. You may not have met them, you may not know their names, but they are inside you, in your instincts, in your brilliance, in your ability to rise even after being pushed down again and again. What you feel in moments of deep reflection, that unshakable sense that you were made for something greater, that is not your imagination. That is memory, ancestral memory. It is the echo of those who refused to be forgotten, those who lived in times where their names were stolen, but their power remained untouched. That power is in you now, waiting to be awakened. There is a legacy that has traveled through centuries, across oceans and deserts, through storms of silence and systems of erasure, just to arrive in you. It didn't stop when the stories were stripped from the textbooks. It didn't disappear when the images of greatness were replaced with images of pain. It didn't vanish when the world told you who you were not. That legacy hid in your DNA, in the rhythm of your heart, in the way your spirit refuses to be broken. You come from people who knew the stars not by telescope but by soul. You come from people who knew how to speak to the earth and listen when it spoke back. You come from people who built with their hands and their hearts. Their courage did not die with them. And now it lives in you. You have inside you the blood of those who never stopped building, even when their kingdoms were destroyed. You carry the vision of dreamers who never got to see their dreams come true, but believed in the future enough to keep going anyway. You walk with the wisdom of elders who understood life not by books, but by spirit. This is your inheritance. It was not bought. It was earned through sacrifice, through silence, through struggle, and now it is yours to carry, not as a burden, but as a banner. You are not just a survivor of history. You are its continuation. Sometimes the world tries to define people by what they lack, but you are defined by what you carry, and what you carry cannot be taken away. It is older than borders, deeper than books, stronger than system. When you walk into a room, you walk in with more than your name. You walk in with the memory of civilizations that the world tried to bury. You walk in with the presence of sacred people whose stories were hidden not because they were weak, but because they were powerful. And when you speak, when you move, when you create, those stories speak through you. They said the Tellem vanished, but their strength built the cliffs. They said Mapungubwe was forgotten, but their vision shaped a kingdom. They said Beta Israel was lost, but their faith traveled through fire, and now all of that lives in your heartbeat. You are proof that they were never truly gone. You are the evidence that their lives mattered, that their wisdom survived, and that their power continues. You are not only part of the story, they are part of you. The pain they endured, the knowledge they carried, the dignity they held even in silence, all of that is woven into your being. Your very existence is resistance. Your ability to think, to question, to imagine something greater that is sacred. You are the result of centuries of hope. You are the dream that refused to die. The world may not have taught you this, but your spirit already knows. That's why you feel called to more. That's why you can't be satisfied with mediocrity. That's why you feel this deep pull toward meaning. You're not chasing success. You're chasing alignment. You're searching for the truth your blood already remembers. You are not lost. You are being guided by voices that were silenced but never gone. You are more than what society labels you. You are more than the images shown to you. You are more than the limits imposed on you. You are the living continuation of people who moved with divine purpose. And now that purpose is in your hands. They carried it as far as they could. Now it's your turn to carry it forward. Not with shame, not with fear, but with the quiet power of knowing who you really are. And once you know who you are, no one can convince you to settle for less. Once you understand what you carry, you stop shrinking to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold your full truth. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to remember. You don't have to know everything. You just need to be willing to rediscover what was hidden. The greatness in you is not waiting to be installed. It's waiting to be revealed. And as you walk forward, step by step, you walk not alone, but with all of them beside you. They didn't endure so you could doubt yourself. They endured so you could rise. You are the legacy they built with blood, breath, and belief. Carry it with pride, live it with intention, and let the world see what cannot be silenced any longer.